Okay, so today we're going to talk about the key battles in the American Revolution. We're definitely not going to be able to talk about all of them, so these are the ones that I need you to remember. Okay, so the very first battle that we're going to talk about, we've already brushed over, so I'm going to go over it really quickly. It was Lexington and Concord in 1775. And as we've talked about before, it was the first shot in the American Revolution, also known as the shot heard around the world. It's going to become known as a shot heard around the world because by the end of the American Revolution, we're going to have several countries besides England and America involved in the American Revolution, thus pulling in all the major powers of the world at that time. Okay, so the second battle that you need to know is the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it also happened in 1775. Basically what happened were the colonists, the militia, was at top of Bunker's Hill, and the redcoats were going to charge up the hill. Now the issue with this is, yes, the colonists had key military ground, and so you would think, well, the colonists are clearly going to win this. Problem is, the colonists were greatly outnumbered, and they were very short on ammunition. So they do not win the battle, but it is still a key battle because though the colonists lost, they were able to hold their own against the most powerful army in the world. One of the generals for the American colonists said, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." This is very important because he's telling them, do not shoot until you've got a clear shot. You're sure that that bullet is going to be effective. So the colonists were able to hold off the redcoats for quite some time, but in the end they were overcome by the redcoats. So even though it was a loss for the American colonists, it actually really boosted morale in the colonies because they realized that, hey, we were at such a disadvantage with the lack of ammunition, and we were still able to hold our own with the British redcoats. So I think we're going to be okay. It may be a long war, but I think we're going to overcome this in the end. Okay, the next battle, and there were a lot of battles between the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Battle of Saratoga, which we will discuss in class. But the next key battle that you need to remember is the Battle of Saratoga, and it was fought in 1777. America had a decisive victory at the Battle of Saratoga, and it became the turning point in the American Revolution. And the reason it became the turning point is because Ben Franklin had been in France for over a year now, trying to convince the French to send aid, supplies, money, and troops to help fight the American cause of independence. France was very reluctant, even though they were not allies with Britain, they were very reluctant to send aid and supplies to America because at this point it looked as if America was going to lose the war with Britain, and France didn't want to create any more issues than they already had with England. So they had continually said no, no, no. After we won the Battle of Saratoga, this colonial victory allowed Franklin to convince France to send aid, money, supplies, and troops. This was truly the turning point in the American Revolution. At this point, with the help of France, the money, the supplies, the ammunition, the troops, we really had the advantage. One of the most important men that came over to help us was a general by the name of the Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette was only 19 years old, and he was a wealthy man in France, and he came over and was very skilled in his abilities to lead men. George Washington fell in love with Marquis de Lafayette. He considered him his son. Marquis de Lafayette really respected George Washington, and because of Marquis de Lafayette's leadership abilities, as well as some of the other men who came over from France and Germany to aid America, we were able to really turn the military around. prior to these men coming over, it was kind of Washington having to do everything, and don't get me wrong, he was an incredible military leader. Without his leadership, there's no way that we would have gotten this far in the war, but he was thrilled to have these other expert military leaders come over and help guide this young army into battle. Okay, we're also going to talk just a little bit about naval battles. There were several naval battles during the American Revolution. The issue with that is that Britain had, undoubtedly, the best navy in the world. They had hundreds of battleships, and they were highly skilled, highly trained. They were going against the American colonial army and navy, and we really didn't have many battleships, and the ones we had weren't as high-tech as the British battleships. So what we did was, because we knew we were at such a clear disadvantage, we hired privateers. Okay, a privateer is a privately owned ship that a wartime government gives permission to attack enemy merchant ships. We had thousands of these colonial privateers. So the American government hired these privateers, which were privately owned ships. We had tons of those because we were so invested in trade with foreign countries, especially in the New England area. So we hired these ships, and what they did was they would go attack the merchant ships of the enemy, which were the British. They would attack these merchant ships, and they would be allowed to keep anything they claimed or captured on the merchant ship. So that was what got them wanting to do this. That was kind of their payment. And it would hopefully cripple the economy in England because they weren't able to get anything in and out for trade purposes. We did have a small continental navy, and one of the people we're going to talk about is John Paul Jones. He was a naval officer, and he had a very decisive battle in the Atlantic Ocean. He was able with his ship to capture a British ship, and they ended up locking their ships, kind of collided into each other, and they were bombing each other back and forth, both ships taking on water, and the British told John Paul Jones to surrender, and this famous quote, "I have not yet begun to fight," is what he shouted. And in the end, the American ship was taking on water and going under, and John Paul Jones and his crew were able to go on to the British ship, take control of it, and sell the British ship back to America with hostages or prisoners of war, the British naval officers on the ship. Okay, the last battle we're going to talk about, and please keep in mind there were many battles in the American Revolution. These are the key ones that I want you to know. So the last battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Yorktown, and this is the last battle in the American Revolution. American and French troops surrounded the Redcoats, and there was no way out. So there were about 8,000 Redcoats in Yorktown, and the French and the Americans split, and the French surrounded the British on the waterfront, while the Americans came in from the north, and they surrounded the British, and the British had nowhere to go, and so they had to surrender. So the British, under Cornwallis, who was the top general in the British Army, surrendered in 1781 to America, obviously to George Washington, who was a top general in the Continental Army. And at that point, we had won the war, we had won independence. Everything we had fought for and written about in the Declaration had come true. Now, keep in mind that the official end to any war is going to be a treaty. And so the official end to the American Revolution was the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And it had 6 points within it. Number one, of course, it recognized the United States as an independent nation. Britain forfeited all control over the United States politically, economically as well. Number two, it set the boundaries. The Mississippi River would be the western boundary of the United States. Canada would be the northern boundary, and Spanish Florida would be the southern boundary. So basically we had all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, all the way down to Florida. Florida belonged to Spain, and all the way up to Canada. Canada was going to remain in British hands. Number three, the U.S. gained fishing rights off the Atlantic coast of Canada. Number four, all sides would repay the debts owed to the other. So this would include all pre-war debts. So America obviously owed Britain a ton of money from things such as the Boston Tea Party, where they destroyed over 300 chests of tea. Number five, British would return slaves. There were a ton of runaway slaves during the American Revolution who went to the side of the British because the British promised them freedom if they would side with the British or help the British. And when the war was over, America demanded that their slaves or their property be returned to them. Number six, Congress would recommend, notice that word, the states return any loyalist property. During the American Revolution, those that sided with Great Britain, the loyalists, were often mistreated within America, looked on as traitors, and a lot of their property was seized by the states. So Congress said, well, we will recommend that the states do this. Okay, so the treaty sounds wonderful. In reality, most of it was not followed. The U.S. really never was allowed fishing rights. Britain never returned most of the runaway slaves. American states did not generally return land to the loyalists, and neither side paid off most of their debts.